It's been a decade since I built my first PC. This time around, I decided to commit to a smaller, all-black themed AMD build. I'm really happy with how it turned out. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and enjoy. This video is a combination of unboxings and actually assembling the PC together. So I'll be discussing each component, why I chose it, and any obstacles I ran into along the way. Starting off with the Lian Li TU-150 Mini ITX case. This case really drew my attention because I think it's really sharp and sleek, while also being pretty small, and of course I love the handle that's on top. This version includes the tempered glass side panel, which is heavier, but I think it's worth it. Here I'm prepping the case for the build, removing the panels, which as you can see require no tools, which is convenient. For the motherboard, I chose the Asus ROG Strix B550i gaming motherboard. First of all, I think this motherboard looks really cool. Secondly, I chose the B550 chipset because I thought it was a good balance between price and feature set. It supports all of the front I/O connectors on this case, which is really nice. It has two M.2 SSD slots, one on the front and one on the back of the motherboard. The one on the front being supported with PCIe 4.0, which is good enough for me. And the one PCIe expansion slot is also PCIe 4.0, which is nice. It also came with some pretty cool stickers, which, hey, is always a plus. For the processor, I ended up choosing the AMD Ryzen 5800X. At the time of purchasing all the components, the 5800X was slightly more expensive than the 5600X, about $70 more. So to me, it was worth upgrading at the time, although currently when I'm recording this video, I believe the 5600X can be found closer to MSRP. So maybe that would have convinced me to save a little bit of money, but nevertheless, it can't hurt to have two more cores. All right, moving along, we're gonna go ahead and install the processor onto the motherboard. So we're just gonna open the CPU socket here. And when you're placing the CPU onto the motherboard here, you wanna make sure it's facing the right direction. So there's nothing to force here. If the CPU isn't sitting down by itself, then it's likely facing the wrong direction. So yeah, finally figured it out. The correct direction here. It's sitting nicely in there, again, without applying any additional force. Next, we're unboxing the CPU cooler. I chose the Noctua NH-U12S. I know a lot of people go for the bigger brother, the Noctua NH-D15, but I felt like this CPU cooler would meet my needs just fine. And if it doesn't, I can always upgrade in the future, because the nice thing about the Lian Li TU-150 is that it supports bigger air coolers like the NH-D15. We have some thermal paste here, some fan clips and fan anti-vibration pads if you wanted to add a second fan. We have the Intel mounting kit and the AMD mounting kit with spacers and the mounts. All right, next we're going to remove the pre-installed cooler mounting brackets from the motherboard. And we're gonna add our spacers here and make sure the new mounting brackets are facing the correct direction. Here I'm trying to install them upside down, but you want the threads facing upward, because later when you install your CPU cooler, that's how your cooler will attach to these mounting brackets. And lastly here, just making sure everything is nice and snug here with the screws. We're going to install the M.2 SSD next. So here removing the heatsink, and I ended up going with the Samsung 980 Pro, compatible with the PCIe 4.0. May as well, since that slot on the motherboard supports it. I've always had good experience with Samsung, so I decided to stick with them. And this is the first system that I've had an M.2 in, and it's just crazy how small these things are. It took a while to get this tiny screw properly mounted, so definitely took some patience there, but finally ended up getting it into place. And all we have left to do here is to secure the heatsink back onto the M.2. For the RAM, I chose the HyperX Fury 32GB DDR4 with a frequency of 3200 megahertz. My only requirements for the memory was that, of course, it needed to be black, sticking with the all black theme. I did want 32 gigabytes of RAM for mainly rendering or computer science purposes. And make sure to check your motherboard's qualified vendor list for the memory, just to make sure you don't run into any compatibility issues when you install it. Furthermore, when you're securing your RAM, you want to hear it click into place. All right, getting these wires out of the way to prepare for installing the motherboard, installing the I/O shield here on the rear of the chassis. And securing the motherboard onto the chassis here. Next, we're unboxing and installing the power supply. I chose the Corsair SF 750 watt modular power supply. This is one of the higher wattage, small form factor power supplies out there. And if I wanted to upgrade to, say, a 3080 graphics card in the future, this should be able to handle that. Installing the front I/O cables here onto the motherboard, along with the power and reset button cables. And also I'm going to plug in the HD audio cable here, which is a mistake we'll talk about later on. Connecting the motherboard's power cable here. The modular power supplies are great because obviously you only need to use the cables that you need. So it's just a much cleaner look. Using a longer extended CPU power cable here from Corsair and routing it through the attic of the chassis. Did the same thing with the SATA cable as well, preparing to install an SSD on the top of the chassis here. using a Samsung 840 EVO SSD from my last PC build, and tucking it away up top here because it's gray and doesn't quite match the all black color scheme I'm going for. Next, we're unboxing the chassis fans. Sticking with Noctua here. These are the NF F12 chassis fans. This Chromax black swap version of the fan comes with different colored anti-vibration pads. But of course, I'm sticking with black here again. And note here that these fans only come with 4 anti-vibration pads. And so you want the pads on the side where you're going to be securing it to the case. And doing the same thing for the rear case fan. Here I'm loosely installing these screws because I'm going to want to move this fan to align with the CPU cooler. And when you're installing the fans, make sure they're facing the correct direction that you want the air to flow. On these Noctua fans, where the label is, that's where the air is exhausting. So in this setup, we're pulling air from the front of the case to the rear. All right, moving on to installing the CPU cooler. So of course we need to apply our thermal paste. I'm not trying to make things too complicated here, just going for the small dot in the center of the processor. I erred on the side of using less thermal paste than more because I really don't want to have to go back and clean excess paste that found its way off of the processor. And here securing the CPU cooler onto the processor. And one mistake I did here was I should have plugged in the cooler's fan first before installing the CPU cooler, because now it's really tight back there and it's hard to see what you're doing. Rerouting the HD audio cable here, because when it's routed to the bottom, you can't install your graphics card. This was a huge pain. Make sure you do it before installing the CPU cooler. All right, installing the last SSD into the case here. We're sticking with Samsung. This is the 870 EVO with a capacity of 500 gigabytes. Didn't have stringent requirements here, just wanted a simple, reliable, and black SSD. And the EVO models from Samsung are a little more affordable. Just wiring the power cable here for the SSD. And finally, securing it into place. And got some thermal paste on the top of my cooler here, so using some iso alcohol and a cotton swab to remove it. And finally, we are able to install the graphics card. This is my Gigabyte 1060 with 6 gigabytes of VRAM. Initially got this GPU for virtual reality games, and it's held up quite nicely. And even though I'm doing an all black build, I figured especially since I have the tempered glass side panel, I may as well get some LED lights to show it off. And again, should have plugged in this RGB header before installing the CPU cooler, and now it's a pain. But after a lot of patience, finally got it plugged in correctly. And the length of these LED strips works really nicely with this case. Wrapping things up, just doing a little bit of cable management. During the build, I really tried to do the best that I could with managing the cables. And note, there's not a whole lot of room in the attic up here on the top of the case. And some final cable management here on the back side of the motherboard. Again, not a whole lot of space back here, but it was just enough for the cables that you see here. Lastly, applying all of the panels back onto the case. And a couple of thumb screws to secure the SSDs. Finally, the long-awaited first power on. I didn't use my external microphone here, so it's just my phone picking up the audio, but the fan of the power supply is going full blast. At first I thought it was one of the case fans that's plugged into the AIO pump header, but unfortunately it was not, so had to perform an RMA for the power supply, and it took about 4 weeks to finally send it off and get the new one in the mail. So that was pretty disappointing, but after finally getting the new power supply and getting it installed, first power on with it installed, it was behaving as expected. And I'm really satisfied with how the build turned out. Honestly, for my personal preference, I'll probably be either dimming these RGB LEDs or turning them off when it's just me, but they're nice to have for when you want to show it off to others. Let me know what you think of the build. I'd love to hear some feedback, so like or leave a comment below. Thanks for sticking around, y'all. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.